She had never confused proximity for belonging. 4 years of breathing the same recycled air as Solomon Crane had taught her that much. He wasn't the kind of man you belonged to. He was the kind of man you survived. You learned his patterns, you anticipated his blind spots, and you kept your name out of every sentence he spoke to men who carried weapons underneath their jackets. She was good at surviving. She'd been doing it since she was 17, standing in a church parking lot in Detroit with $43 and the hard, specific knowledge that nobody was coming for her. Not her father, who'd left a note and not a forwarding address. Not the aunt who'd tried for 2 years and then quietly stopped trying. She'd learned arithmetic young. What things cost, what they were worth, what the difference was. She'd made herself useful to people who could afford to pay for useful. And eventually she'd ended up here. 32nd floor, clean glass and recycled air, the invisible architecture of Solomon Crane's empire running through her fingers like water she had learned to shape. She was good at that, too, shaping water so it looked like something that had never moved. Crane's office was a room that absorbed noise. Dark wood, heavy furniture, a window that looked out over the city like a man who owned it, which was more or less accurate if you adjusted for the particular meaning of the word own. He didn't look up when Willa walked in. He rarely did. She'd learned not to take it personally, which had taken about a week, and then she'd learned to use it, which had taken about a day after that. She dropped the single printed sheet on the center of his desk. The Dana Group transfer cleared the Meridian threshold 4 days early, she said. If you wanted it below the reporting floor, the timing was wrong. I've rerouted through the Calumet sub-account. It'll settle clean by Monday. Crane turned the page toward him. He read it in the time it took her to set her pen on the edge of his desk. The original transfer order came from your office, Willa said, through Reed. He's been running the timing off last quarter's schedule, which is outdated. I'd suggest telling him. I'll handle Reed. Crane set the page aside. The port contracts, Thursday meeting. I need the quarterly breakdowns. They're already in your system. Red folder, left drawer, tabbed by period. She picked up her tote from the chair beside the desk. I'm leaving at 5:30. The particular quality of the silence that followed was something she'd catalogued carefully. This was the weighted kind. Not angry, not confused, but recalibrating, like a scale that had just had something unexpected placed on it. Your usual departure is 7, earlier if the night runs long. My contract specifies 5:30, Willa said. She kept her voice the way she kept her accounts. Clear, no unnecessary entries. I stay late because the work requires it. Tonight the work is finished. She zipped her bag. Everything for Thursday is prepared, referenced, and flagged in yellow where you'll want to push back on Hargrove's numbers. You'll be fine. Crane leaned back in his chair. He was a large man, not physically imposing in the theatrical way some men in his position cultivated, no performance of it, just the settled density of someone who'd never needed to perform. There was a scar along his left jawline, faint and old, the kind that had long since stopped being a story and become just a feature of his face. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully name, which was unusual. She could usually name his expressions. She'd had 4 years of practice. Where are you going? He said. Personal appointment, Mr. Crane. She had called him that since the first week. He'd told her once to use his first name. She'd thanked him and continued not to. The formality was a wall, and she'd built it deliberately, and it had served her well, and she saw no reason to remove it for a man who took down every other wall he encountered as a matter of professional habit. He didn't push. Men like Crane rarely pushed directly. They circled, they repositioned, they made the landscape shift around you until the path you'd wanted to take simply didn't exist anymore, and the path toward them was the only flat ground left. She recognized the method because she'd seen it applied to other people. She was careful not to let it be applied to her. Fine, Crane said. It didn't sound fine. Good night, Willa said. She left. The restaurant Noah had chosen was a small Italian place in the West Loop. Low lighting, handwritten menus, The kind of room that smelled like garlic and old wood and didn't take reservations. She'd been precise and efficient about nearly everything in her life for years. She hadn't been on a date that didn't feel like a transaction in longer than she wanted to calculate. She'd let her hair down in the cab, literally pulled the clip out and shaken it loose, the way she only did at home alone. She was wearing a dress she'd bought a year ago and hung in the back of her closet with the tag still on. Burgundy. She felt faintly ridiculous. She decided to feel it and keep moving. Noah Finch had been waiting when she arrived. He'd stood up, which she noted without meaning to. He was a high school English teacher who coached the debate team on Thursday afternoons and had a dog named after a dead poet and an apartment that smelled like books and coffee grounds. He knew nothing about the specific mechanics of how shipping manifests were falsified or why certain city council's members occasionally reconsidered positions they'd held loudly for years. She had chosen him in part for exactly that. The wine was good. The conversation moved without effort. No subtext, no angling, nobody counting the cost of words before they spent them. He made a joke. She laughed, and the laugh was real, and she noticed it was real the way you noticed a sound you hadn't heard in a long time. He reached across the table at one point and covered her hand with his briefly, just for a moment, just the casual warmth of it, and she let herself feel that too. Quantified it. Decided it was good. She glanced toward the front window at some point. A reflex, old habit. The kind that came from years of knowing that the people around Solomon Crane were people who paid attention to their surroundings. The window was fogged at the edges from the heat inside. There was a figure in the dark beyond the glass, standing just outside the light. She blinked. By the time her eyes sharpened, whoever it had been was gone, or hadn't been there at all. Pedestrian traffic on a wet street. A trick of the light. She looked back at Noah and forgot about it. He texted twice the following week. The first message arrived Saturday evening. Something came up at work. Really sorry. Can we push the coffee thing? She'd said, of course, no rush. She'd meant it. She was not a woman who built scaffolding around a single dinner. The second message came Tuesday and was shorter, rougher. A message sent by someone trying to sound unbothered and clearly not. Sorry, Willa. It's a rough week. I'll reach out when things settle. He didn't reach out when things settled, because as she came to understand, things didn't settle. She gave it 10 days. She wasn't going to chase someone who'd decided to disappear. She'd made that rule young, and the rule had held. But something nagged at her. Not hurt, she checked carefully, and the figure was lower than she'd expected, something more like a column that refused to add up. She knew what slow retreat looked like. She'd seen men lose interest before. It was a gradual thing, a tapering, a lengthening of silences. What Noah had done wasn't that. It was a door slamming, fast, total, and immediately followed by the sound of a building code being changed. 3 weeks after the dinner, she was cross-referencing transfer timestamps on a Meridian subsidiary account when she pulled the wrong entity by accident. She'd meant to open one shell and opened an adjacent one instead, a holding company she recognized by structure if not by name. It had acquired a lease portfolio in the West Loop 17 days ago. Among the properties, a 6-unit residential building on Halsted Street, purchased from the previous landlord under a 48-hour sale clause. All month-to-month tenancies terminated within 72 hours of the closing. Noah lived on Halsted Street. Willa sat back in her chair. The room didn't change. The air conditioning ran its low hum. The city moved outside the glass the way it always moved. And she sat perfectly still in the middle of it, looking at a number that told her everything. She opened the deeper terminals. She went through the property filings, the non-profit 990s, the corporate registration records, the thin and careful tissue of official documentation that wrapped every transaction Crane authorized. She'd built this architecture herself. She knew every seam. She knew where the paper was strongest, and where, if you pressed at the right angle, it showed the shape of what was underneath. The private foundation that had funded Mercer High School's debate and arts programs for 3 consecutive years had revoked its grant commitment. effective immediately, administrative restructuring, board decision. The Foundation's 3 board members included 2 names she recognized from Crane's corporate calendar. The revocation date was 11 days ago. Noah's employer had posted the position listing 4 days later. English teacher, secondary level, effective next semester, termination for cause. 11 days, beginning the morning after their dinner. She sat with that for a long time. She was not a woman who reacted before she'd confirmed her data. She confirmed it twice. Then she confirmed it a 3rd time, because this was the kind of number you didn't want to get wrong. Then she thought about the shadow at the window. She thought about the way Crane had looked at her desk as she'd walked out that evening. Not the look of a man watching an employee leave on time, but something else, something that had recalibrated when she wasn't watching. She thought about 4 years of proximity and careful walls and the particular frequency of silence that existed between 2 people who had decided not to say something and were both aware of the decision. She thought about Noah Finch, who coached debate and had a dog, and had done nothing in his life that warranted what had been done to his. The anger arrived cleanly. She recognized it, named it, and let it do its work. She started printing. She walked into Crane's office without knocking. He was on his phone, standing at the window, bourbon in hand, the posture of a man managing a problem from altitude. He glanced over his shoulder when she entered. He held up a finger. She walked to his desk and laid the papers down. She aligned the stack with the blotter edge. She waited. He finished the call in under a minute and turned around. He looked at the papers before he looked at her. That told her something. Not guilt, because men like Crane didn't perform guilt easily, but the controlled stillness of someone encountering a variable they'd thought was contained. "Find a billing error," he said. His voice was level. It was always level. "I found a pattern." She went through it in sequence: the property acquisition, the lease termination, the Foundation's revocation, the termination for cause. Each document on its own was explainable. Together they were a signature, and she had been reading his signature for 4 years. Crane didn't pick up the papers. He read them where they were. She watched his face while he did, and she watched it do very little, which was the answer. "He wasn't in your world," Crane said finally. "He wasn't supposed to be." Willa kept her voice below the line where it would shake. She was angry enough that the line was close. "He was in mine, my off-the-clock contracted hours ere over, private world that I am legally and humanly entitled to have. He bought me dinner. He was kind to me." She paused. "You dismantled his entire life in 11 days because he held my hand for 40 seconds. He wasn't right for you." The honesty of it landed like a weight dropped from a height. "You don't get to decide that," she said. "You decide port tariffs and union contracts and which federal inspectors get replaced. You don't get a vote on who sits across from me at a table." "Willa." "I'm not finished." She pulled the second document from beneath the stack. Not his records, hers. "I've been processing your accounts for 4 years. I know what you're worth to the last digit, and I know what it cost you to take down one 31-year-old school teacher with no connections and no leverage. That tells me this wasn't calculation." She set the document in front of him. "So here is the calculation now." She laid it out without theater. Noah's job restored. The grant to Mercer High reinstated. His building's lease reissued through a channel with no traceable connection to Crane or anyone in his network at market rate. Permanent. All of it within 72 hours. And in exchange, the permanent removal of his name from anything Crane had decided to monitor, manage, or consider a variable. "Oh," Crane said. His voice had gone quiet in the specific way it went quiet before a decision. "No threats," Willa said. "I'm not built that way. But I want you to understand something clearly." She met his eyes and held them. "I've kept copies of everything I've processed for this organization. 4 years of transactions. Encrypted, off-site, outside your network, with automated instructions that operate independently of whether I'm available to execute them." She let that settle. "I built you a machine, Mr. Crane. I know every gear. I know where it runs smooth and I know exactly where it doesn't. She stepped back. I'm not a line item. I'm not an asset in your column. And the cost of forgetting that is something you're capable of calculating better than I am. The silence in the room had a different quality than usual, heavier. She'd heard it before, in the moment before a man who was accustomed to winning understood that the board had shifted without his permission. Crane reached forward. He picked up the document. He picked up his pen. 72 hours, he said. 72 hours. Willa, he said her name in a way she didn't have a category for. Good night, Mr. Crane. She left. Noah got the call from his principal on a Friday afternoon. Willa knew because she had made sure to know, not as surveillance, just as confirmation that the account had cleared. The grant was reinstated the following Monday. New lease issued by Thursday. She didn't tell Noah any of it. There was no version of that conversation that didn't require explaining things she couldn't explain to someone's who lived in a world where those things didn't happen. He texted her the following week. Tentative, brief, something about his week finally settling, asking if she still wanted to get that coffee. She said yes, she meant it. She didn't go, not yet. She needed something to settle first that had nothing to do with Noah Finch. 3 weeks after she'd placed those papers on Crane's desk, she was alone in the outer office at 8 in the evening, finishing a projection model that didn't need to be finished tonight, for reasons she was being precise with herself about not examining too closely. The building had gone quiet. The bullpen was dark except for the blue glow of her monitor and the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling glass. She heard him stop in the doorway. Not approaching, not announcing himself, just stopped the way a man stopped when he'd planned to say something and had reached the edge of his nerve. She was familiar with that stop from a distance, but she'd never heard it directed at her before. He walked over and set a coffee cup on the corner of her desk. Paper cup, blue stripe, from the place on Michigan Avenue she'd mentioned once in passing. Once, 18 months ago, a comment she'd made in passing and forgotten. He'd apparently not forgotten. He pulled a chair from the empty workstation beside hers and sat down. He didn't say anything. He just sat there in the blue-lit quiet of the office at 8 in the evening, drinking his coffee, occupying the space beside her, the way a man occupied it when he'd run out of strategy and was left with presence. She looked at him for a moment. I'm not going to pretend I understand what you were thinking, she said. About Noah. No, Crane said, you don't need to. You were wrong. He turned his head. He looked at her directly, and it was the kind of look that went somewhere past the surface. I know. She let that land, recalibrated. Is that an apology? It's an acknowledgement. I'm better at those. He turned the cup in his hands. I don't think of people the way you do. I think of positions and risks and what something costs versus what it produces. I've done that for a long time. It stops being a choice and starts being a language. He paused. He wasn't a risk. He was a person. I understand that now, and I understood it wrong then. It was the longest she'd ever heard him speak about something that wasn't business. You thought he was making a claim on something you'd decided was yours, Willa said. Crane didn't answer. You need to stop doing that, she said, running the math on my life as though it's a subsidiary. I'm not a holding company. You don't get a seat on my board. I know. Tell me you know, and then show me you know. They're different things. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Crane didn't smile easily, and she'd decided years ago she didn't trust men who did it too readily. It was something smaller, a controlled loosening of something he'd been holding in place for a long time. You had the archive ready for 2 years, he said, and you stayed. The work was interesting, the money was good. Willa. It was the way he said her name that she noticed. Not the word, he'd said it before, but the register of it, the absence of anything covering it. I see you, Crane said. It came out with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing every word because he didn't have many left. I have been seeing you for 4 years, and I have made myself not say it because I am very good at calculating what things cost and what I stand to lose, and the calculation always came back the same answer, that the risk was too much. He looked at the window. The city glittered below, indifferent and continuous. I was wrong about that too. Willa sat with it. She thought about the parking lot at 17, the gym bag, the arithmetic of survival, the very specific iron decision she'd made about never wanting anything she couldn't afford to lose. She looked at the coffee cup on the corner of her desk. Temperature, ratio, the right place. He'd remembered something she'd said in passing 18 months ago, and he'd acted on it tonight without being asked. She thought about what the word tomorrow meant from a man who operated in years. "Go home, Mr. Crane," she said quietly. He stood. He collected his cup. He walked to the doorway and paused there, which she'd never seen him do. He didn't hover. He moved from point to point with the certainty of a man who didn't second-guess direction. He was second-guessing now. "Tomorrow," he said. Not a statement, not exactly a question, the space between them. "Tomorrow," she said. "We have the Thursday projections to finalize, and there's still an irregularity in the Calumet sub-account I haven't closed out." She turned back to her screen. "After that we can talk about the rest." She heard him breathe out, controlled, with effort. "Good night, Willa." She didn't look up. "Good night, Mr. Crane." His footsteps faded. The elevator opened and closed. The building held its quiet. Willa sat in the blue glow of the monitor and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what had accumulated over 4 years without her permission. The attention she'd catalogued and filed under irrelevant. The particular frequency of their silences, the way she'd memorized his tells, because she'd told herself it was professional due diligence and known, somewhere below the spreadsheets, that it wasn't. She looked at the coffee cup on the corner of her desk. She was not the woman who got swept into someone else's orbit. She was not the woman who forgot the parking lot, or the $43, or the lesson she'd written for herself in the cold. Never want something you can't afford to lose. But she'd been sitting in Solomon Crane's world for 4 years, and she hadn't left, and she'd built herself an exit strategy she'd never once used. She'd told herself it was professional insurance. She finished the projections. She turned off her monitor. She picked up the coffee cup and finished what was left, cold now, still exactly the right ratio. She stood in the dark office for a moment. She told herself she'd decide what tomorrow meant in the morning. She was almost certain that was a lie, and she let herself be almost certain, and she took the elevator down. Some men will burn the world down to keep you warm and call it devotion. The real question is whether you trust the hands holding the match, or whether you've been the one holding it all along. Willa didn't fall for Solomon Crane because she lost her footing. She fell because she looked down, saw exactly how far it was, and made a decision. Was that love, or was it just 2 people with dangerous ledgers deciding the other one was worth the debt? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you love stories about women who refuse to be anyone's blind spot, subscribe to Mafia Longing Stories. A new story drops every week.